Welcome, everybody. My name is John Dichtel. I'm the president and CEO of AASLH, and I want to welcome you this afternoon to this wonderful webinar that we're going to have. We've got a great turnout. The webinar is Museums and Healing for Ourselves and for Our Publics. Thank you all for being here today. We've got a great panel this afternoon. This is the second webinar in a series based on the new book, Changes Required, Preparing for the Post-Pandemic Museum. And the book is the newest in there it is. The book is the newest in the AASLH series that we published with Rowman and Littlefield. And you can get your copy of the book at the URL that we'll post in the chat. We're excited to have your comments in the chat. There'll be time for questions at the end. If you order a book, of course, if you're an AASLH member, you will get a 20% discount from Rowman and Littlefield. And in addition to partnering with Rowman and Littlefield, we've also partnered with museumexpert.org on this webinar. We're thankful for their help in organizing this webinar and the other webinar and others that might be coming, and for the work that museumexpert.org is doing for the entire field. And now it's my pleasure to turn over the introductions to Marcia Semmel, who is the co-editor of Changes Required. Marcia is the author of Partnership Power, Essential Museum Strategies for Today's Networked World, which came out in 2019. She's a renowned now independent consultant in the museum field. She's worked in all different kinds of places, had a remarkable career, including being president and CEO of Conner Prairie and of the Women of the West Museum. She also worked in the Division of Public Programs at NEH for many years, and had a huge impact on the field when she worked at the Institute of Museum and Library Services for 10 years. And she's here with us today to do some introductions. So please take it away, Marcia.
Oh, well, thank you so much, John, for your kind words. And thanks to AASLH for co-publishing our book. So we're very, very grateful to you. And we're also grateful to Eric and to Matt Arthur for helping pilot this Zoom for us and keeping the chat going and posting in the chat some of the big themes that we're going to be exploring today. I wanted to just start by saying I am a cisgendered white woman. I'm wearing bright red glasses. a tan turtleneck, and a navy blue cardigan. And I'm coming to you from my book-filled home office in Arlington, Virginia. It's really a pleasure, and we want to thank a museum expert as well for giving us the opportunity to give some of our 48 authors of the book a chance to speak about not only their essays, but they're thinking about their big themes in the couple of years since the book. Well, the book was only published less than a year ago, but the essays were written actually in 2021. The book grew out of a series of Zoom conversations and blog posts that involved Avi Dechter, Ken Yellis, and myself, the three co-editors. And we began our conversations in the spring of 2020 as we listened to our colleagues from across the museum world in all different disciplines and types and sizes of museums, the sort of nested crises of the COVID pandemic, as well as the urgent need to address systemic racism, loom large for almost everyone who was part of our conversations. Yet also looming large was the realization that the need for major change in our field actually predates the events of 2020 and following, that there have been many signals from our communities, our funders, our staff members, and other stakeholders that our prevailing and accepted models of practice, leadership, stewardship, organizational structure, and certainly DEAI practice were outdated and needed a fair amount of attention. So we asked 48 different museum leaders in different types of museums, in different positions, and from different generations, with some special attention to BIPOC colleagues, to pen short personal essays about 12 different themes that relate to the changing world of museums. And today I'm pleased to introduce three of them. Andrea Jones, Associate Director of Education at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum. Mary Ruth Leftowich, Senior Director, Museum Operations and Education at the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. And Izetta Autumn Mobley, Director of Interpretation, Collections and Education at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of African American History and Culture. You can find their bios on LinkedIn. And each of their essays really deals with different dimensions of our overarching theme, museums and healing for ourselves and for our publics. I'm just going to say a bit about how each one of them links to the topic before I turn to some of the big questions that we're going to explore together. In Andrea's essay, Getting Lost on Purpose, she noted that in 2020, there was a full-blown identity crisis that loomed for museums. And Andrea evoked transitions guru William Bridges and invited museums to appropriately mourn and grieve over what had been lost through the shutdowns. But before moving on to their new beginnings, she urged them to, even with prevailing uncertainties, listen to the winds of change and experiment with new ideas and identities that could lead to successful reinvention. And in fact, if museums didn't indulge in this kind of self-examination, she noted that the lack of introspection could come back and bite them in the future. In Mary Ruth's essay, Self-Worth, Trust, and Wonder, she draws on her experience at the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh and the legacy of Pittsburgh icon Fred Rogers as the inspiration for some different approaches to her leadership style. Mr. Rogers, for those of you who might remember, centered the importance of building trust across staff ranks, recognizing and honoring people's sense of self-worth, and emphasizing curiosity, play, and reflection, both in leaders themselves and as values to be promoted and encouraged throughout the organization. And last but far not least from least, Izetta Autumn Mobley's essay, Uncertain Afters, focused on the widespread discrimination and prejudice across our field against people whose minds and bodies are perceived as falling out of the range of normal or acceptable. In addition to the many isms that have been recognized, sexism, racism, and homophobia, etc., Izetta spotlights ableism and notes that museums need to recognize that over any person's lifetime, congenital disability, accidents, illness, or aging impact how we move through the world and what accommodations we need to function as full members of society. She noted that disability is far from the norm. Disability and disabled people are the norm. And as someone who broke a knee and a hand this summer, I can really feel that. And I think all of us, as we've looked at our headlines and read articles and seen the news on television during the past months, the issues raised by our authors, of course, not only remain and should remain top of mind for museum workers, but they're top of mind for many workers who've come back to work or opted not to come back to work as they are dealing with issues of mental health, stress, anxiety, and accessibility. And those issues, whether they're coming from one of the isms that we talked about or about the lingering impact of the pandemic, they continue to be present in society and certainly in our museums. Indeed, the headline on page 2 of this morning's Washington Post reads, "COVID during pregnancy increases risk of death, study finds." So just one example. So what we'll move on to do today is I'm going to facilitate our conversation. My colleague editor, Avi Dector, will make summative comments. Eric and Matt will follow the chat, and we hope that you put your questions in the chat. And this session is being recorded. Closed captioning is live, so hopefully everyone can have access to our discussion. So I'm going to start with asking each of our panelists to just give a brief introduction to your organization, just a couple of minutes each, especially since 2 of you have moved on to different organizations. So I think I'll stay in alphabetical order and start with Andrea, move to Mary Ruth, and then Izetta, and then we'll do a deeper dive into the issues at hand. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia. I guess I'll start off with my physical description. I'm a white middle-aged woman with short hair, red glasses, and I'm in my office with a lovely fake plant on my left, and a black sweater with shirt with eyeballs. My museum is the Anacostia Community Museum is part of the Smithsonian Institution. It was formed in 1967, right at the height of the Black Power movement in DC. So it really came out of a desire to tell stories from African-American perspective, which was missing in the past. And it also started as one of the first community-centered museums in the country, and we are oftentimes, used as a model for others who want to know how to do that work. And I will say, from being here, we're constantly learning. So, we don't have all the answers to all of that, but I say that the identity of the museum is a little bit strained by being a part of the Smithsonian, but also needing the Smithsonian, benefiting from the Smithsonian. We're obviously we're well funded for the most part compared to other museums. We get that name recognition, but at the same time, being responsive, as I learned through the pandemic, was a little bit harder because, the Smithsonian is a large machine, and being a part of that means that you can't just act on your own all the time. So that's a little bit about my museum. Who would you like to go next, Marcia?
Mary Ruth.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mary Ruth Leftwich, white middle-aged woman with sort of shoulder length brown hair, sitting in my office surrounded by artwork from Amplifier of women activists. I work with the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. We operate 2 museums, the Jamestown Settlement Museum in Jamestown, Virginia, and also the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown in Yorktown. We sit on either sides of a peninsula with Colonial Williamsburg in the middle. So we form the historic triangle here in Virginia. JYF is a state agency, and it grew out of 2 commemorations, the 1957 commemoration of the 350th settlement of Jamestown, which was in 1607, and then also the commemorations for the bicentennial at Yorktown as they commemorated, well, the most recent commemoration until the 250th, back in 1976. And so interestingly, to work in state organizations in general, but one's particularly rooted in this idea of commemoration and the ways that we are trying as a brand new leadership team, our JYF leadership. I am like one of the most second tenured in our leadership team. I've really been here not quite 2 years. So our new leadership team really trying to think about what that means to move from commemoration to really thinking more critically about our collective and shared history to make an impact.
Thank you. And Izetta.
Hello, good afternoon from Piscataway and Nacotchee land in what is now known as Washington, D.C. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as Director of Interpretation, Collections, and Education with the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. I'm in front of a gallery wall, and I have on a fuchsia sweater with black glasses with purple wings. But I'd also encourage us to think about what it means to displace visual primacy and think about the voice as a powerful way to guide us. In my work with the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland, African American History and Culture, got it all out in one go. We're part of a group, of course, of African American history and culture institutions that put the history, culture, art, and collections of people of the African diaspora at our center. And I come to this work with a deep sort of compassion and love of the creativity of the museum field, and as both an academic and as a practitioner, where we're seeing so many of these issues show up for our community members.
Great, thanks so much. I wonder whether we can start by looking outward a little bit and talk a little bit about how each of you in your current roles have addressed this issue of healing and the role of our museums as places of healing in all the different dimensions of that word, whether it's through your programs. What are you doing to make your visitors more welcome and enhance their feeling of safety and comfort? So I don't know who wants to go first. Mary Ruth, I'm going to call on you since you're in a new place.
Sure. So I think what's interesting for JYF, and I'll talk specifically for Jamestown Settlement right now. And so we are not the place where originally Jamestown was. We're not the fort. That is a private and national park site next door to us. But one of the things that has really struck me in my time here is I've never worked in a place that has a history as sort of deep and profound in terms of thinking about colonialism and thinking about the ways that we intentionally acknowledge the healing that we still have to do. We most often refer to ourselves as the first permanent English settlement in North America. And that is why Jamestown has been important for so long. But we're trying to sort of recenter that and think about the ways that we also understand are Indigenous communities and Black communities, and the stories that are embedded here. And the mission actually for JYF really is to think about the convergence of these three cultures, right, and impacts and legacies. And what becomes interesting when we then think about, okay, we're going to broaden our story. And that was the first step when I got here, was to say, how do we make sure we don't always centralize the English story? That is not the perspective we always lean into, because that's what they've been doing since 1957. And in that space, what we've recognized is that we haven't built the institutional trust to begin doing that work really effectively. Like, we haven't done that healing work. And so when we make the invitation to, we had an Indigenous artist who came, an activist who came last year, and she started her lecture by saying how scared she was to be at Jamestown. And when you step back, you're like, oh, right, of course. I mean, this becomes a place of genocide for Indigenous peoples, right? And similarly, we hosted a first Juneteenth program, and thinking about Jamestown as being the origin of slave codes that are then perpetuated, right? And there was a moment where, even though we did that programming in connection with African-American artists, we saw members of the African-American community who essentially said to us, like, what audacity do you have at Jamestown to be doing a program about Juneteenth, right? And so what we're working to right now is to center not the healing piece, and building trust. And I think that actually comes back to when I was talking originally in my chapter about trust in terms of inward, but this job has given me a renewed sense of what that means to build trust in an outward capacity with our communities, because this work is never going to move forward in a productive way if we can't build trust. So we've also established a new director of community engagement role. Here we've started, an Indigenous Peoples Initiative. So there's a lot of pieces. We're starting to hire curators for the cultural representation. So there's a lot of pieces in that, but at the end of the day, for us, outwardly, trust is going to have to be about building relationships in a way that JYF as a state agency wasn't previously invested in, right? It was a tourist place. So that's sort of the journey that we've been on, thinking about trust and the sort of outward healing that we have to do. And of course, we have to first recognize that there's a problem. And that has been, frankly, the hardest step. At the point that I've come in this organization is saying, like, there's another way of doing this. There's a more holistic way of doing this that's not just about the first permanent English settlement in North America.
Thanks so much. Izetta, I spent Sunday afternoon in the Reading Frederick Douglass exhibition at the Reginald Lewis, and I noted beanbag chairs and couches and text in very large type and fonts. And so maybe, I don't know if you want to talk a little about whether that's part of your work in healing and welcoming that you're instigating at the Lewis Museum.
I'm so glad you were able to see it, Marcia. That's lovely. Mary Ruth, part of what you're saying about critical trust, both in the chapter in the book and what you just shared, is really resonating with me, because I also think about critical trust as an action. And so part of what we're trying to do with our exhibits is think about what actions display that we can be trusted to really actionably engage equity. And so something like saying that you believe in accessibility and then actually having seats available for people to sit down, right? Or saying that we want to be accessible to a range of young people and children, and then creating seating that is really ideal for young people and children across a range of abilities. Or having conversations, as we often did as we were working on the Reading Douglass exhibition, where I would say, oh, text isn't quite large enough, and we're going to go up in font, even if that seems outside of the norms of what we might generally do in traditional museum practice. We're going to make the font even larger. And we have started to institute, we don't use serif font, so it's all sans serif font. Because it's not only an accessibility issue around thinking about who can see, right? So can you see the text, but also thinking about literacy. and also thinking about the exhaustion of people's eyes when you're on screen so frequently. So that is part of what our intervention has been. We've also established an accessibility task team to get us to really think about how can we weave accessibility in, because accessibility and thinking about ableism is so tightly tied with how we think about race and racism in this country. So much of how we establish ideas about racism are deeply tied to how we think about ability and who has ability and who doesn't. So you can't really talk about disability in this country without also thinking really critically about race and vice versa. And we're trying to think about that and how we do our exhibitions as well. And then I would say we're also thinking about that. There's an exhibition that we're working on that really delves into what does it mean to mourn? And what kind of Black cultural practices of mourning have been used to really help communities through periods of mourning. So really providing opportunities even in our exhibitions for reflective thinking for community members as they're in our space.
Great, that's fantastic. Thank you. And Andrea, this is not part, I think, of your formal work at Anacostia, but I remember that during COVID shutdowns, you actually created an exhibit on your fence by your house that was about, wasn't it things people lost and things people found during their early stages? And that work, it seems to me, has been extended by some of the strategies that you've used at Anacostia Museum to do different techniques, but also think about impact in some new ways.
Yeah, I think that, thanks for remembering that. That was kind of fun to do. I think everybody in these times kind of thinks of themselves not just as a person who works at a certain museum, but as a person who is a museum person at large, and I think doing an exhibit for $500 on my fence with my neighbors was one of the best museum experiences I've had.
I just posted the link in the chat, I think.
Oh my gosh, thank you. It was crazy. I mean, that was my favorite. I got to be on NPR. That was like the most famous I've ever been. But yeah, I think that as Izetta's talking about accessibility, that's one of the big themes of the last 2 to 3 years for me is not that kind of accessibility, but where we do our work, making, so I think people have written about this thing called the threshold fear, right? Like not even going into the museum because, I don't know, various reasons. Maybe you think the building is intimidating. Maybe you don't want to be frisked by security. It could be geographically not, convenient. And the museum, so I've only been here since the pandemic. So I didn't really know this museum before that. I mean, I was a consultant and I worked here as a consultant, but I think that I was ready for that because of the work that I was already thinking about. I was starting to think about with some other colleagues who were part of a little project that we did called Free the Museum, where we started thinking about the museum building as kind of a limitation. And then when the pandemic hit, well, this is like perfect. This, now our buildings are actually like dangerous to be in. We measure our success a lot of times in museums by using things like dwell time and that sort of thing. But like dwell time is like what you don't want in a pandemic, right? So it kind of became an excuse to kind of get people to I guess get outside the building, and I think a lot of people did, but one thing that I think what that does is it alters the power dynamic, because you are we can decide what we want to have in our buildings for the most part, but we can't necessarily decide to put something like in a neighborhood without making relationships, without like you're talking about, Mary Ruth, getting that trust. Trust is so important. And as a part of the Smithsonian, I realized that there were barriers to overcome, because some communities have actually not had good experiences with the Smithsonian, and whether it was our museum or not, with the name still comes with that baggage, so when we did the first thing my first project here was to put a museum exhibit outside in a neighborhood. It was called Men of Change. So this is kind of like, I started on my fence, and then I was like, can somebody give me more money to do more things? But it was really a really great learning experience. Both were, because with all those trust relationships had to be formed in a community that was, this is at the height of the pandemic and racial reckoning, and all this kind of stuff already made everybody very tense. But it was really I think a successful venture, in a lot of ways. I don't think it was 100%. I would do things differently, but I'll show you. I have like some analog pictures here. So this is like a picture of the scaffolding that we used to put up the exhibit, where it was about African American men of change, and it was in an area of town that was very much overlooked, where the narrative of that neighborhood was crime, and poverty, and not, hey, come see an culture. And so we found that a lot of neighbors were really proud of that. And in terms of accessibility, so we did a study, which was great. We ended up learning that gosh, where's my statistic? 56% of those that we interviewed had never visited our museum before, that had been going to the to Men of Change. So some of like just under half had not even heard of our museum, so it was doing something there for visibility, and it was also doing, speaking of healing, right? Like one of the things that we think of museums as, what their main purpose is education, right? Learning. And in fact, the folks that we hired to do the evaluation of Men of Change were like, okay, let's check and see what they learned about all of the Men of Change. Did they know their names? And I was like, no, this isn't about that. In fact, all of it, it was more important that it be there like as a whole. Like here are, dozens of African American male faces that are uplifting, like they're full of accomplishment and pride and daring and righteousness, and in a community that looks like that, and really like wanted, it's more of like an emotional thing as a whole, rather than learning the names and the dates and the facts, right? So the fact that there were things that happened in that during that time that I would not have thought to measure. Like people said that the city picked up the trash more often since the Smithsonian was in the neighborhood, which if you can do that, why not, right? Like that's a great effect as far as I'm concerned. It shouldn't have to be that way, but I think those kind of like intangibles are not often thought of by museums. So those are some of the things. And then we just continued to kind of iterate on that with where we do our work, because we were shut down for so long. We created a street team of educators to do work outside of the building. I have their picture too, check them out. they did like street style activations and performances around town. And that's one thing that's going to stay with us, I think, in our kind of infrastructure. So that's really, really fun. And then the last thing I wanted to say was an unexpected thing that I think, well, some museums really did rise to the challenge during this time in terms of giving not just like the healing that people needed, but the physical needs. Like we noticed that, well, in our neighborhood, we have the highest rates of food insecurity of any part of the city. So do those, do people who are hungry most need a museum exhibit? Maybe not. Maybe they just need food, right? So we partnered with an organization called Feed the Fridge to install a refrigerator in our parking lot, which serves and still serves 100 meals a day. How they do it is the Feed the Fridge handles it all. They get the meals from restaurants, so it supports local businesses, and then they stock it every day, and people just come and take what they need. And I mean, are those museum visitors? I don't know, but I think they are. They didn't even come inside the building, and they didn't interact with anything that we designed, but I still feel like those are our folks.
So thank you, Andrea. I mean, I've known Izetta a fairly long time, because I remember when she's done some performance public programs when you were a graduate student, but we won't go into that, I don't think. But I think each one of you in one way or another in your pieces sort of within your organizations have asked the questions about possibility. You've opened yourselves and your institutions to new possibilities. I can't remember now who said it. I think I'm not sure which one of you, but this notion of how might we? Maybe it was you, Mary Ruth, in your piece. And so I'm just watching the time, and I want to sort of start smushing the inside and the outside, because I don't think you are able to implement your visions right alone. So maybe this is a place we can just start talking about your practice. Izetta writes in her piece how entrenched docents were in their sense that they couldn't show their own issues. They saw who they are in some ways as weak until Izetta just put out those chairs, and the docents all love to sit in them. But how could talk a little bit about those strategies for getting others on board? I mean, if you have a museum studies degree, you might not be willing to try one of these things. It might be just too risky, too vulnerable, whatever. So I don't know who wants to start talking about that. Either Mary Ruth or Izetta to start, perhaps.
I mean, I think what I'm struck by all three of us being in conversation with each other is wonder, play, trust, and design thinking. And it comes out in each of our three pieces in different ways. But even as we're thinking about things like wonder, or thinking about things like critical trust, that there's still a piece for all three of us about, at some point you have to apply this. And what does the application look like? Because it can't simply be that we've said this and then we don't apply it. And then that's where things like thinking about really effective community partnerships, asking questions about where we do our work and how we do our work. I think I said in my piece toward the end, at some point, someone has to put out the chairs, right? So there's all this lovely thinking that has to happen, right, about why we do our core work and how we do it and what those investments and commitments are. And then at the end of that, someone has to go get the chairs. Someone has to go get the agenda. someone has to turn on the closed captionings, right? There are action pieces that happen at each of these pivotal moments. And that wonder and play and trust, maybe so many of us have been taught that that's a soft skill, but then when it comes time to the application, that kind of design thinking, that kind of trust building becomes so vital to really being able to not only execute our work, but maybe even pivot and shift so that we can be even more effective or agile or responsive.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think to pick up on what Isaiah was saying, and certainly my chapter was all sort of bound in this work of Fred Rogers, right, which is really does center wonder and play and curiosity. But he did that work and he did that research. And to be clear, he was very well researched in this, right? And he just didn't decide to show up one day with puppets, right? I mean, it was very intentional, the work he did based on learning research. And he did that work for early learners. And I think one of the things that I was trying to do was say, how do we understand these things to be true for people regardless of age? And that was a question that was actually asked of me by a school district superintendent, right? Wanting to know, like, how do we take the learnings of Fred Rogers and make it applicable? And I think when you begin to say, like, these are not only the foundational building blocks that early learners need, but that we all need to have self-worth. We all need to have trust. We all need our curiosity to be, stoked, and have time to play and have time for reflection and solitude. And those are not things that have ever been, in my experience, really prioritized, certainly in museum workplaces. Whenever people ask me, the happiest time where I've ever worked, is like when I worked at the Container Store. Actually, it was the happiest place, not just because I love storage and organization, right? But it was about the culture that was created. And so I thought a lot about the ways that you can create a culture of community in the workplace around these principles of what Fred Rogers was saying that we needed as the most significant building blocks or foundation for our early learners. And I think that you action it by really beginning to check yourself against those things every day. I mean, that's at least what I've done, right? I mean, I love this analogy of, like, did you put out the chairs? Like, did I actually create a meeting agenda that allows for play and for wonder and for curiosity? Are we creating team cultures that allow for us to make sure that we build trust? In my time at JOAF, I've implemented a lot of change. And, the saying goes, right? Like that change moves at the speed of trust. And you have to be able to build that trust if you ever want to see that kind of change. So I think those are the pieces in an inward-looking way that have been critical for me in the last few years, bridging the pandemic and thinking about the ways that we need to invest in our staffs in that way.
Great. Thank you. There is a question. I know I want to hear Andrea, but there's a question that I read very quickly because it was a long question, but it is about, speaking of Fred Rogers, a person who has colleagues who are very timid when it comes to what they can put out for children. And, the kinds of activities, programs that children will be able to participate in. And I guess I'm hearing from you that there's kind of a continuum, and that there's not some straight line where children, aren't able to perceive or participate in programs. I don't know if anybody wants to answer that question, and I apologize if I've butchered your question. Anybody?
So, I mean, I do think also trying to read and listen at the same time. I think that that's actually what the work of Fred Rogers will show you, is that he was able to really adapt and make even the hardest things accessible to children, right? Like, you can have hard conversations, you can do complex things with them, but you have to do it in a way that is accessible to them. So it's not ever a matter of saying, don't do this with kids. It's finding a way that is age appropriate and meets them where they are. And then you can do that work with them. And I personally also always create spaces of, iteration, and it's okay. We've had program we piloted for 9 years, right? So like, it doesn't have to be right the first time. and really letting your teams understand that they are in a place where it's okay to fail. You know, like learn from the failure, fail forward, all of those kinds of sayings. And then with kids, it does take a lot of trial and error, I think.
I think, oh, go ahead, Andrea.
Oh, I was gonna actually reference you, Isaiah, because I'm sure that you've been used to telling people that when you make things accessible, you make it better for everyone, right? And I think it's the same thing with kids. If you make things that are good for kids, adults love it. I mean, and I'm not talking about like preschool. I mean, I think there's like different things that are better for different age kids, right? But I mean, you know, things that are participatory, that, you know, have, you know, nice, you know, aesthetically interesting colors, things that invite you to look and learn and don't have itty bitty type, right? Like all that kind of accessibility stuff, I think plays well with being welcoming to children in ways that you wouldn't expect. Like you wouldn't think, oh, well, there's no toys in here. It's like, it's more than that, you know? So I don't know, putting that out there as a kind of a outside the box way of looking at what is for kids and what's not for kids.
I mean, I always think it's really interesting too, because there's a stereotype of young people as not being able to be abstract thinkers, but in fact, children are incredibly like abstract thinkers because they're making up these wonderful imaginative worlds. So I think in the same regard, we also have to think about the human experience. So if the museum is a space of lifelong learning, then it is also a space of lifelong development. And we as humans are developing from being young people to adults to middle age to aging, right? And that part of what the museum can do is actually be a space for not only lifelong learning, but lifelong investigation of our lives as humans as we develop. And that's part of why having trauma-informed approaches to the way that we think about our audiences, the way that we think about our exhibitions becomes so critical, because we're humans having this diverse array of experiences, some of which is like deeply grounded in trauma that we are trying to developmentally even begin to comprehend. And so if we think about that and how we design our exhibitions, or how we let young people find spaces to release their trauma, or how we even allow a culture that may be in denial about anything traumatic having even happened. We're like, what? Nothing happened. Everything is normal again. Right? If you provide spaces for that, then you're actually providing spaces for people to continue to understand themselves as human and to learn throughout their lives.
Thank you. You know, our time is quickly moving, but Sarah asked a question that I think is really important and gets to something that we've all talked about a little bit, but let's get a little deeper. And today, there's still, I think, a lot of stress, a lot of trauma, a lot of anger, a lot of anxiety, and workers in all areas. But this question really has to do with workers within the museums. And if you could talk a little bit about some of the strategies that you've tried in your respective organizations to aid your staffs and to help them as they navigate this space. I know I heard a webinar the other day where the founder of Capital Creative said her advice would be not do more with less, but let's learn to do less with more. So, but why don't you each address that so that we can move on and answer Sarah's question. So Mary Ruth, you had a hypothesis that you brought from Pittsburgh to.
Yeah, my hypothesis was very much rooted in the chapter, which I wrote in a time of personal and professional transition for me as I was leaving institutions. And I came to a museum. I sort of left the trauma that I had in my old museum and came to a workplace where they had their own sort of trauma and institutional trauma. And I think that is very real. I think cultural institutional trauma is very real. And I think that the pieces that I've done in the time that I've been here has been to, one, sort of let people feel like they are safe. And the way that I've done that from the very beginning, and the way that I build conversations, the way we set meetings, even things that may sound, for those of us who are in education and do a lot of facilitation, you're like, ground rules, that seems basic. But actually, when you do that in a much broader sense in an organization, when you say out loud, assume good intentions, it was like, oh, I had not done that before. And so setting those kinds of regular ways of making sure that you're calibrating what people need, what their expectations are. And I think being, always being really transparent with people is key. And the other piece that to me has been important is making sure that people feel comfortable and sort of bringing whatever they want of themselves into their work. And in a way that is not overwhelming, in a way that we aren't saying, take work home with you, but draw this line, let there be a life work balance. I will not email you, or I will not call you after 5 p.m. on work days, right? And to let people sort of have that breathing space, because I think in the pandemic world, our day lives and our after work lives, all of that got so constricted and so connected. And so we've been really spending a lot of times trying to think about work-life balance. But when you're here, bring with you what you want to bring, but then also when you leave, really truly leave. And I think that those pieces have been successful so far in the work that we've been doing.
Great.
I think one of the things that I'm really thinking about too is remembering that the pandemic is not actually over, and that being able to have an experience where the pandemic is over is actually can be representative for a lot of people around privilege and access and power, right? And so part of it for me has been a reminder that the pandemic and its after effects and its uncertain afters are not actually over. And even though people may want it desperately to be over, that doesn't mean that we've actually processed it. So really trying to think about giving people space and time for reflection, really trying to think about maybe people's ability isn't the same as it was pre-2020, right? Because you've got 1 in 4 people who now have long haul COVID. So that may staff-wise change our entire relationship to what people can now do, right? Maybe pre-pandemic, you didn't need a mic to be in the gallery and be able to project, but now maybe during pandemic and post illness, now you do. And so it's really thinking about these kinds of ways of being in the present moment of the reality and still planning and being thoughtful around how not only accessibility, but helping people to process, doing things that might benefit everyone, right? But that are not necessarily targeted toward this is something we're doing because of COVID, right? That help people evolve and change. And it's not like we haven't seen this before, right? In human existence, after the bubonic plague, lots of things change, right? That then stay with us. So we have to think about this moment as forever having actually changed us.
Thank you. Andrea?
I was having a couple of different competing thoughts, but I was looking at the question about trauma-informed teaching, and thinking about this museum in particular, our audiences have experienced a lot of trauma. I would say more than the average, right? Like this is a museum where lots of different marginalized people find themselves in the stories of, the exhibits and things like that. And that's, kind of one thing that I've found really important is to kind of look at it with that in mind. Everything that we do, think about people who have actually experienced, like if you're talking about food insecurity, right? How does this sound to someone who has actually experienced food insecurity? Are you saying like these people do, are you treating it with, I guess, the respect and dignity that it deserves, right? So I think that's something that I will probably continue to keep with me as I, in the field. And the other thing that I was going to say is maybe some failures that we're experiencing. I feel like what's happening right now is that we are being pushed, like pulled back in the building, and we're now, at like full rate programming, full scale, exhibition development, doing all the things. And so this really if you plan a large scale event, that takes a lot of capacity. We're talking about not only money, but people's time and energy. And so it's a really different cadence, I feel like, than from the pandemic, where we were busy, but we were doing kind of larger projects. We were like, how could we still be relevant? And so we try, these things. And now it's kind of feeling more like back to the grind a little bit. I don't know if y'all are experiencing that same thing, but I worry, I worry about how busy we keep ourselves, because you do not get to reflect and you do not get to be intentional. I mean, I advocate being intentional all the time and grappling with these questions, but what time do you have to do that, if you are just going from one thing to the next? So I don't know. I don't have an answer to it. I'm just more like complaining about it. I don't know if you.
So one of the things that we have done is, I have asked.
And I'm sorry, I'm interrupting a little bit, but we only have like 2 more minutes. So, but please, Mary Ruth, because I was just going to ask you about some practical suggestions for dealing with that. So you're on.
So my 2 minutes is we literally block times on our calendars to take time. It's like planned pauses for even like a department-wide level of like, do not bother us during this time. This is reflection time. On my personal calendar, I have 3-hour chunks twice a week that is like, I am not scheduling meetings. I am not doing this. It's a very different way from the way that I used to work. But for my mental health and for the mental health of the people that I work with, I think that has been really helpful. And we definitely are working on less is more. It's a huge shift to the question I saw in the chat about budgets and understanding all of that, that I'm working through. But that is definitely the mantra we are trying to actually live and ask ourselves repeatedly.
I could keep this conversation going for at least another hour. Speaking of my tendency toward more, I want more instead of less. But it's 3:25, so I have to turn this over to Avi for some closing remarks. I can't thank you all enough, not just for your participation and for your essays, but for the work you're doing every single day. So Avi, why don't you provide some summary wisdom?
This is certainly a challenge given the richness of the conversation. I want to thank Marcia and the panelists for sharing with us so many insights and so many possibilities. It seems to me that I want to frame this in the largest possible way, and that is to suggest that COVID and its traumas basically confronted all of us, and I don't mean some of us, I mean all of us, with the challenge of dealing with novelty, dealing with something that we had not been prepared to deal with, in some cases hadn't known about, certainly did not anticipate, and where there were no obvious and clear solutions, tried and tested solutions. So I think that a lot of people responded by shutting down. A lot of institutions, however, and somebody said, well, people want to go back to where we were before. That's not going to happen. 3 major turns took place in the last 3 years. The turn to digital, which is almost universal now among mid and large size institutions and many smaller ones as well. And they're not going to go back to that no matter what. The turn to community and the turn to equity. And all of these are facts. They are not suppositions or hypotheses. They are the facts of life in 2023. And it seems to me that what it did for us as practitioners was that it forced us to make shifts in our mental construction of the world. we had to start thinking about things differently. We had not only to think about our policies and our practice, but our whole mental map of how the world works. And I think that the three panelists have called out to us one of the most critical elements of this, and that is that all of the boundaries that we went into 2020 with have shifted radically. They are more permeable, or they've been erased altogether, or in a few cases, they've hardened. But we can now see that the boundary that once separated our institutions from the community doesn't hold any longer. We need to rethink that boundary, if there ever was one. We need to think about the boundaries that separate each of us from our colleagues within the institution. And we also have to think about the boundaries that we have mentally imposed on our visitors, separating children from adults, people of one race from another, people of one kind of interest from another, people of one background from another. So I think that we have seen an opportunity here in projects, whether they are large-scale projects, as Mary Ruth said, we're going to think about a broader story, whether they are putting an exhibition on your fence, or whether they are increasing the font size so that people with visual impairments are able to read the text without asking somebody for help. It seems to me that all of these possibilities are possibilities for healing. And we need to seize those opportunities. Healing is not healing, safety, security are not extraneous to the core functions of a museum. They are part and parcel of the functions of a museum. To put it in the largest possible terms, COVID and our responses to COVID have forced us to expand the boundaries of moral responsibility. And I want to thank the panelists for calling that to our attention.
Thanks for reminding us that we have a moral responsibility. I needed that today.
Walter, I think you're on.
I think I am. Thank you so much, Abby, for these concluding words about the conversation that just happened here. I'm not going to do the same. Of course, you did it so well. But I just want to remind how these conversations and points that have been brought up both by the panelists and in the chat are things that are so close to the strategic views that we have as an organization at museumexpert.org. I just want to say quickly the connection between building staff in the museums, create a community of people who care for each other within the museums that are respected is a basis for having good connections with the community that we want to serve outside. And so that is so core to what we want to do as an organization in the future. And then there are challenges, as people mentioned, that is, how are we going to convince leaders today not to go back to what was? Because that seems to be a big trend and a big challenge as well. So we will follow this up, and we just scratch a little bit deeper every time. Our next webinar is going to be on February 8th with Martin Storsdijk, that you may know. He's been in the museum field as a professional and then as an observer and someone who studied museums for 30 years. He's now professor at Oregon State University in these matters. And we will go a little bit more deep in this aspect of how to build fulfilling careers in museums. And so we're going to do, we will explore strategies with him to create pathways to careers that are personalized, fulfilling, and future safe. As I said earlier, this is the real basis for doing good work outside as well. So put that in your agendas, February 8th at 2 p.m. With our next webinar with Martin Storsdijk. Thank Marsha and Avi for this collaboration as usual. Thanks to AASLH for being a great partner and for the technical support that they have provided and the promotion that they've provided for this webinar. Absolutely. And thanks to the attendees who have been extremely active in the chat as well and giving us a little bit food for thought as well. So thank you all, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.